The crystalline halls of the Galactic Council's primary station hummed with nervous energy as representatives from 1,200 civilizations gathered for what many believed would be humanity's final judgment. Ambassador Zethkar of the Vorthak Dominion adjusted his ceremonial robes, his 6 eyes scanning the vast assembly chamber where beings of countless shapes and forms had come to witness this unprecedented moment. For 3 centuries, the human species had been the Galactic Council's greatest success story. When they first achieved faster-than-light travel in 2387, humanity had arrived at the galactic stage as aggressive, territorial creatures fresh from a homeworld scarred by endless wars. The Council, in its infinite wisdom, had taken these violent primitives under their wing, teaching them the sacred principles of diplomatic resolution, peaceful coexistence, and the absolute sanctity of life. The transformation had been remarkable. Within 50 years, humanity had become the Council's most ardent supporters of peace. They established the Harmony Protocols, created the interspecies meditation centers, and developed conflict resolution techniques that had prevented 17 major galactic wars. Human diplomats were requested across the galaxy. Their unique ability to find peaceful solutions to seemingly impossible conflicts, making them invaluable mediators. But today, everything was about to change. Ambassador Sarah Chun stood at the center of the Great Chamber, her small human frame dwarfed by the massive alien delegates surrounding her. Despite being only 5.5 feet tall, her presence commanded absolute attention. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the traditional white robes of a human peace ambassador, though something in her eyes suggested those robes might never be worn again. The Vorthak representative, Zethkar, activated his translation matrix and spoke to the assembly. "We have gathered today because the human delegation has requested permission to address the Council regarding recent events in the Kepler sector. The floor is yours, Ambassador Chun." Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "Honored representatives of the Galactic Council, for 300 years, my species has embraced the path of peace you showed us. We believed, as you taught us, that all conflicts could be resolved through dialogue, that violence was always the worst option, and that life was sacred above all else." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The humans' dedication to peace had become legendary throughout the galaxy. Their peacekeeping forces carried non-lethal weapons, their military had been converted into disaster relief organizations, and they had not fired a shot in anger for over 2 centuries. "We trusted in these principles," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "Even when the Zephyrian Raiders began their systematic extermination campaigns in the Outer Rim territories. Even when they ignored every diplomatic overture, every peace treaty, every humanitarian plea. We believed that patience and understanding would eventually prevail." The chamber fell silent. The Zephyrian situation had been a growing concern for months, but most council members believe it was just another minor territorial dispute that could be resolved through the usual channels. 3 days ago, Sarah's voice broke slightly. The Zephyrians attacked the human colony of New Geneva. It was a peaceful agricultural world, home to 2 million civilians. They had no military installations, no strategic value, no weapons beyond farming equipment. The colonists attempted to surrender immediately when the Zephyrian fleet arrived. Ambassador Lokhtar of the Aquatic Federation shifted uncomfortably in his biosuit. The Zephyrians have been increasingly aggressive lately, but surely this was an exaggeration. Civilized species didn't engage in wholesale slaughter. "The Zephyrians didn't want surrender," Sarah said, her voice now carrying across the chamber like a death knell. "They wanted extinction. They systematically hunted down every man, woman, and child on that planet. They burned the hospitals with the patients still inside. They destroyed the schools while children cowered in classrooms. They broadcast the massacre across subspace channels, making sure we could watch every moment of the slaughter." The holographic display activated, showing grainy footage from New Geneva's last transmissions. The assembled delegates watched in horror as peaceful farmers were gunned down in their fields, as families were torn apart, as children's screams echoed across the burning landscape. Many of the more sensitive species had to look away as the brutal reality unfolded before them. 2 million people, Sarah whispered, though her voice somehow carried to every corner of the vast chamber. 2 million innocent souls who died believing that peace would protect them, that the Galactic Council would intervene, that someone would save them. They died believing in the principles we had all sworn to uphold. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usually vocal crystalline collective remained motionless, their prismatic forms dim with shock. Sarah reached into her robes and withdrew a small device. With deliberate movements, she placed it on the podium before her. Every delegate recognized it immediately. It was a human peace treaty seal, the symbolic representation of humanity's commitment to nonviolence. We brought this tragedy before the Emergency Council session yesterday, Sarah continued. We presented evidence of 17 similar massacres across the Outer Rim. We showed you the data, proving that the Zephyrians have murdered over 50 million innocent beings in the last 6 months. We begged for intervention. The ethereal representative, Whisper of Ancient Winds, spoke through his translation device, his voice like autumn leaves rustling. Ambassador Chun, surely you understand that these matters require careful deliberation. The Council cannot act hastily. There must be proper procedures, diplomatic channels, investigation committees. Sarah's laugh was bitter and cold. Procuraduras. Investigation committees. While entire worlds burn and innocent children are murdered in their sleep. Do you know what the Emergency Council's final recommendation was? Honored Whisper of Ancient Winds. She activated another holographic display, showing the official council response. A strongly worded letter of concern. A request for the Zephyrians to attend a voluntary mediation session. A suggestion that affected species should consider temporary relocation to avoid further unpleasantness. The word unpleasantness hung in the air like a curse. 50 million dead beings reduced to unpleasantness by bureaucratic language. This is the moment, Sarah said, raising the peace treaty seal above her head, that humanity formally renounces the path of peace. The seal, crafted from rare Terran crystal and embedded with the genetic markers of every human diplomat who had ever served the Council, had never been broken in 300 years. It represented an unbreakable vow, a sacred commitment to nonviolence that had defined human civilization for generations. Sarah Chun brought it down hard against the podium. The crystal shattered with a sound like a dying star, its fragments scattering across the chamber floor. Where each piece fell, tiny holographic images appeared. The faces of the dead from New Geneva, from the 17 massacred worlds, from the 50 million innocent souls who had died while the Council debated proper procedures. As of this moment, Sarah announced, her voice now carrying the weight of absolute certainty, humanity withdraws from all peace treaties, non-aggression pacts, and conflict resolution protocols. We formally notify the Galactic Council that human military forces are being reactivated and that we will no longer wait for diplomatic solutions to genocidal threats. The assembly erupted into chaos. Representatives shouted questions in dozens of languages, their translation matrices struggling to keep up. The concept of a species voluntarily abandoning peace was so alien to most council members that they couldn't process what they were hearing. But Zethkar, whose species a longer memory than most, felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered the old stories, the legends from before humanity joined the Council. Tales of a species that had conquered its homeworld through relentless warfare, that had turned conflict into an art form, that had been so efficient at violence that they had nearly destroyed themselves. You don't understand what you're saying, called out Representative Bright Chorus of Joy from the Melodic Confederacy. Peace is evolution. Violence is regression. You cannot abandon 3 centuries of progress. Sarah turned to face the musical being, her expression sad but resolute. Progress toward what? A galaxy where genocidal maniacs are politely asked to stop their killing sprees? Where innocent children die because bureaucrats are more concerned with proper procedures than with saving lives? She gestured to the scattered crystal fragments, still glowing with the faces of the dead. These people believed in your version of progress. They died for it. How many more millions will die while we write strongly worded letters? The Quantum Collective's representative, existing in 17 dimensions simultaneously, spoke through a probability cascade. But Ambassador Chun, surely you see that abandoning peace makes you no better than the Zephyrians themselves. Violence begets violence. War breeds only more war. Perhaps, Sarah replied quietly, but genocide breeds only death. And sometimes, honored representative, the only way to stop a monster is to become something the monster fears. She walked to the center of the chamber, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. For 300 years, humanity has been the galaxy's diplomats, its peacekeepers, its voice of reason and restraint. But we have learned something terrible today. We have learned that there are some evils that cannot be negotiated with, some monsters that view mercy as weakness, some threats that understand only one language. Sarah stopped before the Great Seal of the Galactic Council, the symbol of unity and peace that had governed galactic civilization for millennia. The Council has 30 standard days to present a credible plan for stopping the Zephyrian genocide. 30 days to prove that peace can still be effective when faced with absolute evil. She turned back to face the assembly, and for a moment, every delegate saw something in her eyes that chilled them to their core. It was the look of a predator, the gaze of something that had been sleeping for centuries and was finally beginning to wake up. If the Council cannot act, Sarah said with quiet finality, then humanity will. The implications of her words settled over the chamber like a shroud. Species that had known only peace for generations suddenly remembered that not all civilizations had evolved beyond violence. Some had simply chosen to set it aside, like a weapon stored carefully in a vault, waiting for the day when it might be needed again. The human delegation began filing out of the chamber, their white robes rustling like the wings of departing angels. As they left, the scattered fragments of the peace treaty seal continued to glow with the faces of the dead, a silent reminder of the cost of inaction. Zethkar watched them go and felt history pivoting around this single moment. His people had ancient records of species that could fight, species that knew war as more than just a theoretical concept. But humanity was different. They hadn't simply been warriors once upon a time. They had been the most efficient killers their homeworld had ever produced, a species that had turned warfare into science and violence into art. For 3 centuries, they had chosen peace. They had embraced it so completely that most of the galaxy had forgotten what they had been before. But choices could be unmade, paths could be abandoned, and sleeping dragons, once awakened, did not easily return to slumber. As the last human delegate left the chamber, Zethkar accessed his species' historical archives, searching for the old files on humanity's pre-council period. What he found there made his blood run cold. Details of conflicts that had shaped human civilization, statistics on their pre-peace military capabilities, analysis of their strategic thinking and tactical innovations. He found records of something called the Geneva Convention, rules that humans had created to limit the brutality of their own warfare. The irony wasn't lost on him that the colony destroyed by the Zephyrians shared that name. But what truly terrified him were the notations in the margins of the old reports. Recommended that humanity be granted immediate council membership and peace training, read one analyst's note. Their capacity for innovative warfare exceeds that of any species in recorded history. Better to have them as allies committed to peace than as enemies committed to war. Another note was even more ominous. Human tactical adaptability appears to be limitless. They seem capable of finding weaknesses in any defense, of turning any advantage against an enemy, of learning from defeats in ways that make them stronger. Recommend immediate diplomatic contact before they develop interstellar capabilities. Zethkar closed the files and looked around the chamber where other delegates were still arguing about proper procedures and diplomatic protocols. They didn't understand what had just happened. They saw the breaking of a peace treaty as a minor political setback, a temporary abandonment of evolved principles that could be corrected through patient dialogue. But Zethkar's people had survived for millennia by recognizing existential threats before they fully manifested. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that the Galactic Council had just made the greatest mistake in its 10,000-year history. They had awakened something that should have remained asleep forever. In the depths of space, near the edge of Zephyrian territory, old human shipyards that had been converted to peaceful purposes were beginning to stir. Automated systems that had manufactured exploration vessels and scientific research stations for 3 centuries were quietly switching to new manufacturing protocols, ones that had been stored in deep memory banks and marked emergency use only. The awakening had begun. Admiral Marcus Rodriguez stood before the massive viewport in his quarters aboard the UES Diplomatic Harmony, watching the stars will slowly pass as his ship maintained its position at the edge of human space. For 43 years, he had commanded vessels dedicated to peace. Research ships, diplomatic transports, humanitarian relief vessels, all of them unarmed, all of them committed to the principles that had guided humanity for 3 centuries. Today, everything changed. The communicator on his desk chimed softly. "Admiral, we're receiving the activation codes from Earth Central Command." Marcus turned from the viewport, his weathered face reflecting the weight of the moment. He had hoped never to see this day, had spent his entire career believing that humanity's violent past would remain buried forever. But the images from New Geneva still burned in his memory. Children running from plasma fire, families torn apart by Zephyrian death squads, an entire world reduced to ash and silence. "Understood, Commander Walsh. Begin Phase 1 implementation immediately." The transformation began within hours. Throughout human space, automated systems that had lain dormant for centuries suddenly came online. In the depths of research stations and mining facilities, hidden manufacturing bays opened for the first time in 300 years. The peaceful infrastructure of human civilization began reshaping itself with mechanical precision, guided by protocols that had been carefully maintained but never activated. On the industrial world of New Pittsburgh, factory workers who had spent their lives producing agricultural equipment and medical supplies watched in amazement as their assembly lines reconfigured themselves. Molecular assemblers that had been creating life-saving medications suddenly shifted to producing something far more sinister. The same precision that had crafted delicate surgical instruments was now being applied to weapons of war. Director Chun Yuki, no relation to Ambassador Chun, supervised the transition from the command center of the Titan orbital shipyards. Around her, holographic displays showed the systematic reactivation of humanity's war-making capability, a process that had been designed to be swift, efficient, and unstoppable once begun. "Status report on the manufacturing conversion," she called out to her technical team. "Conversion proceeding ahead of schedule," replied Dr. Sarah Kim, her fingers dancing across holographic controls. "The autoforges are operating at 97% efficiency. We'll have the first batch of kinetic artillery platforms ready for deployment in 18 hours. She nodded grimly. The Zephyrians had made a fatal error in their assessment of human capabilities. They had seen 3 centuries of peace and assumed that humanity had grown soft, that their commitment to nonviolence had made them weak. They couldn't have been more wrong. Humanity hadn't abandoned their capacity for war. They had simply chosen to build a civilization that didn't need it. Every human child learned about the old conflicts in school, not as glorification, but as vaccination. They understood exactly what their species was capable of when pushed to extremes, and they had collectively decided to choose a better path. But the infrastructure of war had never been dismantled, only converted. The same factories that built medical supplies could produce weapons. The same engineers who designed peaceful space habitats could create instruments of destruction. The same tactical minds that solved complex diplomatic crises could plan military campaigns. Most importantly, humanity had never stopped studying warfare. Every conflict in galactic history had been analyzed, dissected, and understood. Human military academies had been converted to strategic studies institutes, where theorists spent their time developing hypothetical solutions to impossible military problems. For 3 centuries, they had been refining the art of war while never practicing it. The Zephyrians were about to discover why that had been a mistake. Across human space, the mobilization continued. On the agricultural world of New Eden, farming cooperatives began organizing civilian evacuations from frontier worlds. These weren't panicked refugees fleeing in terror. They were disciplined, systematic relocations carried out with military precision. Every human had learned basic emergency protocols in school, and those lessons were now being put to use. Captain Jennifer Park commanded the evacuation of the mining colony on Kepler 442b, one of 17 worlds in the projected Zephyrian expansion path. Her background was in xenobiology and peaceful first contact protocols, but her great-grandfather had been a military strategist during humanity's pre-peace era, and some lessons passed down through bloodlines. "All civilian transports are loaded and ready for departure," reported her executive officer. "The industrial equipment is being prepared for emergency destruction if necessary." Jennifer nodded, studying the tactical display that showed Zephyrian fleet movements throughout the sector. The enemy was advancing on a broad front, systematically destroying everything in their path. Their strategy was simple but effective: spread terror through overwhelming brutality, break the will to resist before any organized defense could form. It was a strategy that had worked against every species they had encountered so far. The Aquatic Federation had surrendered after losing 3 worlds. The Crystalline Collective had agreed to tribute payments after a single devastating attack. Even the proud Ethereal Commonality had negotiated a withdrawal from contested territories rather than face Zephyrian wrath. But those species had no experience with warfare beyond theoretical knowledge. They had evolved beyond conflict, transcended their violent instincts, become something higher and more peaceful than their ancestors. When faced with an enemy that reveled in destruction, they had no framework for response beyond diplomacy and surrender. Humanity was different. They had chosen peace, but they had never forgotten war. The first sign that the galaxy was about to change came when the Zephyrian scout fleet arrived at the outer edge of human territory. Fleet Commander Vastor commanded 12 heavy cruisers, more than enough firepower to annihilate any human settlement they encountered. His species had evolved from pack hunters, and their approach to warfare reflected that heritage: swift, brutal, overwhelming force applied without mercy or restraint. Human vessels detected on the system perimeter, reported his sensor operator. 3 ships, minimal offensive capability. They appear to be research vessels. Vastor's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. The humans were even weaker than intelligence reports had suggested. 3 unarmed ships against his battle fleet. This would be over in minutes. Open a channel, he commanded. Let them witness what happens to species that resist the Zephyrian Empire. The communication screen activated, showing the bridge of the lead human vessel. Vastor was surprised to see a middle-aged human female in the captain's chair, her expression calm despite facing imminent death. Most species showed terror when confronted by Zephyrian forces. "I am Fleet Commander Vastor of the Zephyrian Imperial Navy," he announced, his translator converting his guttural speech into standard Galactic. "Your territories are now claimed by the Empire. Surrender immediately, and your deaths will be swift." The human captain, her uniform bore the name Rodriguez, studied him for a moment before responding. "Fleet Commander, I am Admiral Marcus Rodriguez of the United Earth Space Forces. I hereby inform you that you have entered human territorial space without authorization. You have exactly 60 seconds to reverse course and withdraw, or you will be considered hostile combatants." Vastor stared at the screen in disbelief. This tiny human, commanding 3 unarmed research vessels against his battle fleet, was issuing ultimatums? The audacity was so shocking that for a moment he couldn't formulate a response. "Did you not understand me, human?" he finally snarled. "We have 12 heavy cruisers. You have 3 defenseless ships. Your weapons are so primitive that our sensors barely register them. What possible threat could you pose?" Admiral Rodriguez smiled, and something in that expression made Vastor's scales crawl with unexpected unease. "Commander, your intelligence files are 300 years out of date. You're assuming that humanity's commitment to peace meant we became incapable of war. That was an error in judgment." "Nonsense, Vusktoshpat. Our intelligence on human capabilities is thorough. Your species abandoned warfare centuries ago. You have no military infrastructure, no weapons of significance, no experience with actual combat. You're sheep pretending to be wolves." "Actually," Rodriguez replied conversationally, "we're wolves who spent 3 centuries pretending to be sheep. There's a significant difference, and you're about to learn what it is." The 60 seconds expired. What happened next defied everything Vastor thought he knew about human technology. The 3 research vessels suddenly changed. Sections of their hulls retracted, revealing weapons arrays that his sensors had somehow failed to detect. The ships themselves began transforming, their peaceful exploration configurations shifting into something altogether more predatory. "Impossible," breathed his sensor operator. "Those weapons' signatures. Commander, they're not registering on any known technology database. The energy output is... How are those ships even structurally intact?" The answer, had Vastor known it, lay in 3 centuries of human scientific advancement. While other species had focused their technological development on art, philosophy, and peaceful pursuits, humanity had continued advancing their understanding of physics, material science, and engineering. They had simply chosen to apply that knowledge to peaceful ends. But the underlying science remained the same, whether building a hospital or a battleship. The same materials that protected human habitats from cosmic radiation could armor warships. The same energy systems that powered terraforming operations could drive weapons of devastating power. The same manufacturing techniques that created life-saving medical equipment could produce instruments of war. The humans had spent 3 centuries becoming the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy. They had just been very polite about it. Target acquired, Rodriguez announced calmly. All ships, implement Hannibal Protocol. Vastor had no idea what the Hannibal Protocol meant, but he was about to learn why human military history was required reading in xenoarchaeology courses throughout the galaxy. Hannibal Barca had been a Carthaginian general on ancient Earth, famous for using elephants to cross the Alps and defeat numerically superior Roman armies through superior tactics and the element of surprise. The human ships moved with precision that seemed impossible for vessels of their size. Instead of the typical approach of closing to weapons range and exchanging fire, they implemented a 3-dimensional attack pattern that utilized the gravitational fields of the system's planets to mask their approach vectors. Vastor's fleet found themselves fighting an enemy that appeared to be in 12 places at once, weapons firing from impossible angles, ships appearing and disappearing like ghosts. The humans were using the system itself as a weapon, turning asteroids into kinetic projectiles and using the star's magnetic field to amplify their energy weapons. "How are they doing this?" demanded Vastor, watching his tactical display dissolve into chaos. "Our ships are superior. Our weapons are more powerful. We outnumber them 4-1. His tactical officer, a young Zephyrian who had studied galactic military history, looked up from his station with wide eyes. "Commander, I think they're using human tactical doctrine. Pre-peace era human tactical doctrine." The words sent a chill through the bridge crew. Every military academy in the galaxy studied ancient human warfare as an example of the ultimate evolution of strategic thinking. Earth's pre-space conflicts had produced tactical innovations that were still considered theoretical masterpieces thousands of years later. But those were historical curiosities, museum pieces from a more primitive time. No one had ever imagined they might be put to practical use. "Sir," called out the sensor operator, his voice tight with fear, "we've lost 3 ships. The humans, they're not just attacking our vessels. They're targeting our command and control systems specifically. It's like they know exactly how our ships are designed." Of course they did. Humanity's diplomatic corps had been studying every species in the galaxy for 3 centuries. They knew the strengths and weaknesses of every technology, every tactical doctrine, every cultural blind spot. Information gathered in the name of understanding and peaceful cooperation was now being weaponized with terrifying efficiency. "Fleet retreat," Vastor commanded, his pride forgotten in the face of impossible defeat. "All ships, emergency jump to rally point 7. But the humans weren't finished with them. As the Zephyrian ships prepared to flee, they discovered that their faster-than-light drives had been subtly sabotaged by exotic particle bombardment. Not disabled, that would have been too obvious, but degraded just enough to make precision jumps impossible. The surviving Zephyrian ships scattered across 17 different star systems, their crews traumatized, and their commander's reputation in ruins. What should have been a quick conquest had become a humiliating rout, and worse, it had revealed something that would terrify the Zephyrian High Command. Humanity hadn't just retained their capacity for warfare. They had evolved it. 3 centuries of scientific advancement, tactical study, and strategic refinement had produced something unprecedented in galactic history. A species that was both more peaceful and more dangerous than anything that had come before. Admiral Rodriguez watched the last Zephyrian ship disappear into hyperspace, then activated his communication system. "Earth Central Command, this is Admiral Rodriguez. Phase 2 is authorized. Begin Operation Restoration." Across human space, the real awakening began. The ships that emerged from hidden shipyards and camouflage stations weren't converted research vessels. They were purpose-built instruments of war, incorporating technology that made the galaxy's most advanced military fleets look like children's toys. The sleeping dragon had opened its eyes, and the galaxy would never be the same. High Admiral Kethvar of the Zephyrian Imperial Navy had conquered 47 star systems and personally overseen the subjugation of 32 different species. His command dreadnought, the World Breaker, was 3 kilometers of reinforced battle steel bristling with enough firepower to crack planets. In his 70 years of military service, he had never experienced defeat, never encountered an enemy that could stand against the combined might of the Zephyrian war machine. The report from Fleet Commander Vastor changed everything. "Repeat that last part," Kethvar growled, his razor-sharp teeth clicking against each other in agitation. "You're telling me that 3 human research vessels destroyed 9 of your warships?" Vastor stood at rigid attention, his scales still bearing scorch marks from his escape pod. "High Admiral, with respect, they weren't research vessels. They only appeared to be research vessels. The humans have developed some form of adaptive camouflage technology that completely fooled our sensors. When they engaged, their true capabilities became apparent." "And what capabilities were those?" Kethvar demanded. "Sir, they move like nothing I've ever seen. Their ships seemed to phase in and out of normal space, appearing behind us, above us, inside our formation. They used the system's gravitational fields like a 3-dimensional maze, turning space itself into a weapon. And their targeting systems. High Admiral, they hit specific subsystems on our ships with surgical precision. They didn't just want to destroy us. They wanted to disable us, study us, learn from us." Kethvar studied the tactical recordings from the engagement, his military mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The human ships moved with a fluidity that seemed to violate the laws of physics, appearing where they should not be able to appear, striking from angles that should not exist. "What does intelligence say about this?" he asked his aide. General Skorthak activated his holographic display, showing reams of data that had been hastily compiled from across Zephyrian space. "High Admiral, we've been operating under seriously flawed assumptions about human capabilities. Our intelligence networks focused on their public technological developments, but we've discovered that they've been maintaining what they call dual-use technologies." The display showed comparative analyses of human peaceful technology versus military applications. Medical nanotechnology that could also serve as adaptive armor systems. Terraforming equipment that could be weaponized for planetary bombardment. Deep space communication arrays that could function as sensor networks capable of tracking fleets across multiple star systems. "Every advance they made in the name of peace," Skorthak continued, "can be directly applied to warfare. But it's worse than that. They've been studying our military doctrines for 3 centuries. They know our tactics better than we do." "That's impossible," Kethvar snapped. "Our tactical manuals are classified at the highest levels." "High Admiral, humans were involved in galactic peacekeeping operations for 300 years. They mediated conflicts between species that used our same technologies, our same strategies. Every time they negotiated a ceasefire or arranged a peace treaty, they learned more about how galactic warfare functions. They've had 3 centuries to analyze every engagement, every tactical decision, every strategic framework used by every species in the galaxy." The implications hit Kethvar like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just been peaceful mediators. They had been intelligence analysts, systematically studying the military capabilities of every species they encountered. All in the name of better understanding how to prevent conflicts, of course. But the knowledge remained the same whether used for peace or war. "Show me the current strategic situation," he commanded. The holographic display expanded to show the entire contested region of space. Zephyrian fleets were advancing on multiple fronts, systematically destroying everything in their path. But now, for the first time in decades, their advance had been stopped. Human forces were deploying throughout their territory, establishing defensive positions that seemed to make no tactical sense. "Their fleet deployment pattern is unusual," admitted Skorthak. "They're not concentrating their forces for major engagements. Instead, they're dispersing small groups of ships across wide areas. It goes against every principle of strategic concentration." Kethvar studied the pattern, a cold dread beginning to form in his stomach. He had seen something like this before in the historical archives of ancient Zephyrian conflicts. It was a defensive strategy used by a species that was vastly outnumbered but possessed superior technology and tactical flexibility. They're not trying to win conventional battles, he realized. They're turning their entire territory into a weapon. Every ship, every station, every inhabited world becomes part of a coordinated defense network. As if to confirm his fears, reports began flooding in from across the Zephyrian advance. Fleets that had been moving forward confidently suddenly found themselves under attack from directions that shouldn't exist. Human ships appeared from behind asteroids, from within planetary rings, from the shadow of moons and space stations. They struck hard and fast, then disappeared before effective counterattacks could be mounted. Admiral Sarah Chun, the same woman who had broken the peace treaty seal, now commanded the human response from the bridge of the UES Vindication. The ship itself was a marvel of human engineering, incorporating 3 centuries of technological advancement into a vessel that looked more like a work of art than an instrument of war. Its hull flowed like liquid mercury, constantly reshaping itself to optimize for whatever tactical situation it encountered. "Admiral, we're receiving reports from our scout networks," announced Commander Park, her fingers dancing across holographic controls. "Zephyrian Fleet Groups 7, 12, and 23 have all sustained significant casualties. Their advance has been halted along a 300 light-year front." Sarah nodded, studying the 3-dimensional tactical display that showed the ebb and flow of battle across human space. The Zephyrians had expected to face a conventional military response. Fleets meeting fleets, armies clashing on planetary surfaces, the traditional pageantry of galactic warfare. Instead, they were fighting something entirely new. "Status on Operation Restoration?" she asked. "Phase 2 is complete," replied Dr. Martinez from the technical station. "All automated defense networks are online. Phase 3 begins in 6 hours." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Operation Restoration wasn't just about rebuilding humanity's military capabilities. It was about demonstrating why the human approach to warfare had been so feared in the pre-peace era. Humans didn't just fight wars. They transformed the very nature of conflict itself. The Zephyrians were learning this lesson the hard way. Fleet Group 7, commanded by Admiral Rathkar, had been tasked with securing the human industrial world of New Birmingham. Intelligence suggested it was lightly defended, with minimal military infrastructure and a civilian population that would likely surrender without significant resistance. The planet was a crucial production center for human technology, and capturing it intact would provide valuable insights into their capabilities. Rathkar's fleet of 28 warships approached the system confidently, expecting to find the usual collection of civilian freighters and lightly armed patrol vessels. Instead, they found nothing. "Sensor sweep complete," reported his tactical officer. "The system appears to be empty, sir. No ships, no active installations, no defensive structures." "That's impossible," Rathkar muttered. "Intelligence confirms this system supports a population of 8 million humans. Where are they?" The answer came when his fleet crossed the orbit of the system's 4th planet. Suddenly, space itself seemed to come alive around them. What had appeared to be empty vacuum revealed itself to be filled with camouflaged defensive platforms, their stealth systems so advanced that they had been completely invisible to Zephyrian sensors. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the platforms weren't attacking. "Sir, we're being scanned," reported the sensor operator, his voice tight with confusion. "Multiple active sensor locks from across the system, but no weapons fire. They're studying us," Rathkar realized with growing horror. "They're recording everything. Our ship configurations, our weapons signatures, our tactical responses. They want to learn how we fight." The human defense platforms maintained their sensor locks for exactly 17 minutes, long enough to compile detailed analyses of Zephyrian technology, tactics, and crew responses. Then they opened fire. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. When it ended, the Zephyrian Fleet Group 7 had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. 17 ships were completely destroyed, while the remaining 11 were left drifting in space, with their crews unconscious from precisely targeted neural disruptor fields. The humans could have killed everyone. Instead, they chose to let them live, knowing that the survivors would carry word of what they had witnessed back to Zephyrian High Command. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare that would prove more effective than any conventional weapon. Admiral Rathkar found himself aboard a human rescue vessel, his command staff around him, all of them alive but utterly defeated. The human medical team treated their injuries with professional courtesy, but The message was clear. Humanity could have chosen death for all of them, and had deliberately chosen mercy instead. The human captain, a young woman who looked barely old enough for military service, visited the Zephyrian survivors in their detention area. Admiral Rathkar, I'm Captain Williams of the U.S. Reclamation. I wanted to personally ensure that you and your crew receive proper medical attention before we arrange for your repatriation. Rathkar stared at her in confusion. Repatriation? You're sending us back. Of course, Williams replied, as if the question were strange. You're prisoners of war, not criminals. The Geneva Conventions are quite clear about the treatment of POWs, and humanity takes its obligations seriously. I don't understand, Rathkar said. Your species has abandoned peace. You're at war with us. Why show mercy? Captain Williams sat down across from him, her expression serious, but not unkind. Admiral, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what happened when we renounced peace. We didn't abandon our principles. We simply stopped limiting ourselves to purely defensive responses. Humanity has never believed that war justifies abandoning morality. She activated a small holographic display showing the battle that had just concluded. Your fleet was defeated using non-lethal neural disruptors and electromagnetic pulse weapons designed to disable rather than destroy. Your ships can be repaired. Your crews will recover completely, and you'll all return home to tell your superiors exactly what you experienced here. The psychological impact was devastating. Every Zephyrian military officer had been raised to believe that war was about domination, that victory meant the complete destruction of one's enemies. The concept of an enemy that could achieve total victory while choosing to show mercy was alien to their understanding. But humanity had learned something crucial during their 3 centuries of peace. True strength wasn't measured by one's capacity for destruction, but by one's ability to choose restraint even when destruction was possible. They had become the most dangerous species in the galaxy precisely because they remained the most moral. News of humanity's military resurgence spread throughout galactic civilization with the speed of quantum communication networks. Species that had grown comfortable with the existing balance of power suddenly found themselves facing a fundamental shift in galactic dynamics. The Aquatic Federation, whose territories bordered human space, called an emergency session of their High Council. Ambassador Lokhtar, who had witnessed humanity's announcement at the Galactic Council, found himself at the center of increasingly frantic discussions. The humans have activated military technologies that our best scientists cannot even understand, reported Chief Analyst Glubmar, her biosuit translation systems struggling with the complexity of the data she was presenting. Their defensive capabilities alone exceed the combined fleets of the Federation. But they've been peaceful for 3 centuries, protested Council member Reef Shaper. Surely this is just a temporary aberration. Once the Zephyrian situation is resolved, they'll return to their diplomatic nature. Lokhtar, who had spent decades studying human behavior patterns, slowly shook his massive head. I don't think you understand what we've witnessed. Humanity didn't become peaceful because they were weak. They became peaceful because they were strong enough to choose peace over war. But when that choice was taken away from them, he gestured to the holographic displays showing human fleet movements throughout their territory. The ships moved with purpose and precision that spoke of careful planning and absolute confidence. This wasn't a desperate defensive reaction. It was the methodical implementation of a comprehensive strategy that had probably been planned for decades. The humans have been preparing for this day for 3 centuries, Lokhtar concluded. They've used their commitment to peace to study every species in the galaxy, to understand our strengths and weaknesses, to develop technologies that make them effectively unbeatable in open conflict. The Zephyrians have awakened something that should have remained dormant forever. Similar conversations were taking place throughout galactic civilization. Species that had viewed humanity as useful but ultimately harmless mediators were suddenly confronting the reality that they had been sharing the galaxy with apex predators who had simply chosen to be vegetarians. The change wasn't just military, it was philosophical. For 3 centuries, galactic civilization had operated under the assumption that evolution naturally led away from conflict, that peace was the inevitable destination of any sufficiently advanced species. Humanity's transformation challenged that fundamental belief. They hadn't evolved beyond warfare. They had transcended it, choosing to become something greater than their violent instincts. But when forced to choose between their principles and the survival of innocence, they had demonstrated that transcendence didn't mean abandonment. The sleeping dragon was fully awake now, and the galaxy would never feel safe again. Emperor Vashti of the Zephyrian Empire stood before the great tactical display in his war room, watching the slow collapse of what should have been his greatest triumph. For 6 months, his fleets had carved a path of destruction through the Outer Rim territories, systematically eliminating entire civilizations and claiming their resources for the Empire. The campaign had been proceeding exactly according to plan until they encountered humanity. Now, for the first time in his 40-year reign, the Emperor was contemplating the possibility of defeat. "Explain to me again," he said to High Admiral Kethvar, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that preceded imperial fury, "how a species that hasn't fought a war in 3 centuries has managed to destroy 60% of our forward fleets." Kethvar, his scales dulled with exhaustion and stress, activated the holographic tactical display. "My Emperor, we have severely underestimated human capabilities on every level. Their technology is not just advanced. It represents a completely different approach to warfare than anything we've encountered." The display showed the current state of the conflict, with Zephyrian forces scattered and demoralized across a 1,000-light-year front. What should have been a simple conquest had become a nightmare of asymmetrical warfare, technological superiority, and psychological manipulation. "Their ships can apparently exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously," Kethvar continued, highlighting engagement records from the past week. "They appear and disappear at will, strike from impossible angles, and seem to anticipate our tactical responses before we make them. But that's not the worst part. What could be worse than invisibility and precognition?" the Emperor demanded. "They're not trying to destroy us," Kethvar said quietly. "They're trying to teach us a lesson." The statement hung in the air like a curse. The Zephyrian Empire had been built on the principle of overwhelming force, the doctrine that superior firepower could solve any problem. The concept of an enemy that possessed superior firepower but chose not to use it was incomprehensible. "Look at the casualty reports," Kethvar said, highlighting specific engagements. "In every major battle, human forces have achieved complete tactical victory while minimizing Zephyrian deaths. They disable our ships instead of destroying them. They use neural disruptors instead of kinetic weapons. They capture our crews instead of killing them. Perhaps they're keeping prisoners for interrogation," suggested General Morthak, the Emperor's chief intelligence officer. "No, my Emperor. They treat our captured personnel according to something they call the Geneva Conventions, a set of rules governing the ethical treatment of prisoners during wartime. They provide medical care, adequate food, and respectful treatment. Then, they return them to us with detailed reports on their own imprisonment." Emperor Vashti stared at the tactical display, his predator's mind struggling to comprehend an enemy that fought with one hand tied behind their back. Every instinct told him that this had to be some form of weakness, some exploitable flaw in human psychology. But the evidence suggested otherwise. "What does prisoner interrogation tell us about their capabilities?" he asked. Morthak activated another display, showing intelligence reports compiled from returned Zephyrian personnel. "The reports are disturbing, my Emperor. Our officers describe human ships that seem to reshape themselves during combat, weapons that fire exotic particles unknown to our science, and defensive systems that appear to violate the fundamental laws of physics. But, perhaps more concerning," the intelligence chief continued, "are the reports about human crew behavior. Our officers describe calm, professional personnel who treat warfare like a complex engineering problem to be solved. There's no rage, no bloodlust, no emotional investment in the conflict. They approach the destruction of our fleets with the same methodical precision they might apply to repairing a malfunctioning space station. The psychological impact of fighting such an enemy was devastating. Zephyrian warriors were motivated by conquest, by the thrill of domination, by the emotional rush of victory. How did one fight an enemy that viewed battle as simply another job to be done competently and efficiently? "We need to change our approach," Emperor Vashti declared. "If conventional warfare cannot defeat them, then we escalate. Prepare the planet killer weapons. If we cannot claim human worlds intact, then we'll destroy them completely." Admiral Kethvar's scales rippled with unease. "My Emperor, Our intelligence suggests that such escalation might be inadvisable. Explain. The humans have been monitoring our communications, studying our tactical responses, learning our behavioral patterns. They seem to anticipate our decisions before we make them. I believe they're expecting us to escalate to planetary bombardment, and they've prepared accordingly. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. What kind of preparation? Before Kethvar could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the command center. Communications officers rushed to their stations, their voices overlapping as they tried to process the flood of incoming reports. My Emperor, called out the chief communications officer. We're receiving a transmission from the human fleet. They're requesting to speak with you directly. Requesting? The Emperor snarled. They're in no position to make requests. Sir, the transmission is being broadcast on all frequencies simultaneously. They've somehow overridden our entire communications network. Every ship in the fleet is receiving this message. The main display flickered and resolved into the image of a human female wearing what appeared to be a military uniform, though it was unlike anything in Zephyrian experience. She was older than most of the humans they had encountered, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that held the weight of command authority. I am Admiral Sarah Chun, commanding the United Earth Defense Forces, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. I'm speaking directly to Emperor Vashti of the Zephyrian Empire. The fact that she could address him by name while broadcasting simultaneously to his entire fleet sent a chill through the command center. The security implications were staggering. Emperor Vashti, Admiral Chun continued, we have monitored your fleet's preparations for planetary bombardment operations. Before you proceed with that course of action, there are several facts you should consider. The display shifted to show tactical data that made the Emperor's blood run cold. Human fleet positions throughout Zephyrian space, previously undetected, suddenly appeared on the map like stars emerging from behind clouds. There were hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, positioned at strategic points throughout the Empire. For the past 6 months, while you were conducting your expansion campaign, human forces have been quietly positioning themselves throughout your territory. Chin explained with clinical precision. We are currently within striking distance of every major Zephyrian military installation, every industrial center, and every populated world in your empire. The implications were staggering. While the Zephyrian military had been focused on conquest, the humans had been conducting the largest infiltration operation in galactic history. They had moved entire fleets through Zephyrian space undetected, positioned themselves for simultaneous strikes against hundreds of targets. This is impossible, whispered General Morthak. Our sensor networks would have detected any fleet movements of that magnitude. Admiral Chin smiled, as if she had heard his comment. General Morthak, your sensor networks have been detecting our fleet movements. However, your analysis software has been classifying our ships as asteroids, space debris, or natural phenomena. We've been studying your detection algorithms for 3 centuries. We know exactly how to avoid triggering your threat assessment protocols. Emperor Vashti found his voice. What do you want, human? We want you to stop, Chin replied simply. The expansion campaign ends now. Your fleets will withdraw to pre-campaign positions. The worlds you've conquered will be returned to their original inhabitants, and you will provide reparations for the damage you've caused. And if we refuse, the display changed again, showing detailed technical analyses of Zephyrian military installations, industrial facilities, and population centers. The data was so precise that it included architectural blueprints, personnel rosters, and real-time security assessments. Then, we will implement what we call the Broken Arrow Protocol, Chun said calmly. Every major military target in your empire will be simultaneously neutralized. Your industrial capacity will be reduced to pre-space flight levels. Your government infrastructure will be dismantled. And your emperor will find himself ruling over a collection of isolated worlds with no means of interstellar communication or travel. However, she continued, and her tone softened slightly, we would prefer to avoid such measures. Despite your actions, we recognize that the Zephyrian people are not inherently evil. You've simply developed a cultural framework that glorifies conquest and domination. That can be changed. Emperor Vashti stared at the screen, his mind reeling from the magnitude of what he was hearing. The humans weren't just threatening military defeat. They were threatening to completely restructure Zephyrian civilization. You would destroy an entire empire to stop our expansion? He asked. No, Chin replied, and There was something almost sad in her expression. "We would rebuild an entire empire to stop your genocide. Every world you've sterilized will be restored. Every species you've eliminated will be honored and remembered. Every civilian you've murdered will be avenged through the creation of something better than what you destroyed. We studied your species' history during our centuries of peace," she continued. "The Zephyrians weren't always conquerors. Your earliest civilizations were based on cooperation, artistic achievement, and scientific exploration. The militaristic culture that drives your current expansion is relatively recent, a response to resource scarcity and territorial pressures that no longer exist. The historical data she displayed was accurate, drawn from archaeological records and cultural analyses that the Zephyrian government had tried to suppress. The empire's foundation myths claimed an ancient heritage of conquest and domination, but the truth was more complex. We can help you remember what you used to be," Chen offered. "But first, the killing has to stop." Emperor Vashti looked around his command center, seeing the faces of his officers reflected in the tactical displays. For the first time in decades, he saw uncertainty in their eyes, doubt about the righteousness of their cause. The humans had done more than demonstrate superior technology and tactical brilliance. They had shaken the fundamental assumptions that held Zephyrian culture together. They had shown that it was possible to be both powerful and merciful, both strong and moral. "What are your terms?" he asked finally. "Complete withdrawal from all conquered territories within 30 standard days," Chen replied. "Reparations to be negotiated with the Galactic Council, and participation in a cultural exchange program designed to help your species rediscover its pre-imperial heritage. And if we comply with these terms, then humanity will withdraw its fleets from Zephyrian space and return to our previous role as mediators and peacekeepers. This conflict ends, and both our species learn something valuable about the nature of strength and restraint." The offer was more generous than anything the Zephyrian Empire would have provided to a defeated enemy. It was also more terrifying than any threat of destruction. The humans were offering to forgive genocide, to help rebuild what had been destroyed, to transform conquest into cooperation. It was a demonstration of power that made their military capabilities seem insignificant by comparison. Emperor Vashti closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Around him, his command staff waited for orders that would determine the fate of their civilization. For the first time in 40 years of rule, the emperor of the Zephyrian Empire was contemplating surrender. Not because he feared death or destruction, but because he had encountered something he had never believed could exist. An enemy that was strong enough to destroy him and moral enough to save him instead. 1 year after humanity renounced peace, Ambassador Sarah Chun stood once again in the Great Chamber of the Galactic Council. But everything had changed. The white robes of peace had been replaced by the deep blue uniform of the United Earth Defense Forces, and where once she had broken a crystal seal of peace, she now carried a small device that represented something far more powerful: the collective will of a species that had remembered how to fight. The assembled delegates watched her approach with a mixture of awe, fear, and grudging respect. The past 12 months had reshaped galactic civilization in ways that would echo for millennia. The Zephyrian Empire, once the most feared military force in the galaxy, had become a collection of peaceful agricultural worlds undergoing cultural rehabilitation. 17 species that had been marked for extinction were now rebuilding their civilizations under human protection. And the balance of power that had governed galactic politics for 10,000 years had been permanently altered. "Honored representatives," Sarah began, her voice carrying the same clear authority it had possessed a year ago, but now tempered with the weight of decisions that had affected billions of lives. "I have come to report on the completion of what we called Operation Restoration." The holographic displays around the chamber activated, showing the current state of what had once been Zephyrian space. Where before there had been military installations and industrial complexes dedicated to supporting a war machine, there were now research stations, cultural centers, and peaceful settlements. The transformation had been as thorough as it was unprecedented. "The Zephyrian Empire has formally dissolved," Sarah announced. "Emperor Vashti has abdicated his throne and requested asylum on Earth, where he will spend his remaining years studying human pre-peace historical archives in an attempt to understand how his species might avoid repeating the mistakes of conquest." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The concept of a conquered emperor requesting to study the history of his conquerors was alien to most species' understanding of warfare and victory. The former Zephyrian worlds have been reorganized into 17 independent systems, each focused on cultural redevelopment and peaceful coexistence, Sarah continued. Human advisors will remain in the region for 5 years to assist with the transition, after which these worlds will resume full autonomy. Representative Zethkar of the Vorthak Dominion, now serving as the Council's senior military analyst, activated his translation matrix. Ambassador Chun, the efficiency of your species' military operations has been remarkable. In 12 months, you've achieved what most civilizations would consider impossible. You've not only defeated a major galactic empire, but completely restructured its society. How was this accomplished? Sarah smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded every delegate that they were speaking with a representative of the most dangerous species in galactic history. Representative Zethkar, the answer lies in understanding what we were fighting for versus what the Zephyrians were fighting for. The main display shifted to show comparative analyses of human and Zephyrian military doctrines. The Zephyrians fought for conquest, for the expansion of their territory, and the subjugation of other species. Their entire military philosophy was based on domination through superior force. Humanity fought for restoration, Sarah continued. We fought to restore the lives that had been taken, to rebuild the civilizations that had been destroyed, to heal the damage that had been done. Our entire military philosophy was based on achieving specific, measurable outcomes that would improve the galaxy as a whole. The distinction was crucial, and its implications were staggering. Species throughout the galaxy had always assumed that war was fundamentally about winning, about achieving victory over one's enemies. Humanity had demonstrated that war could be about fixing things that were broken. When you fight for conquest, Sarah explained, your enemy's destruction is sufficient. When you fight for restoration, your enemy's redemption becomes a strategic objective. The Zephyrian Empire had to be defeated, but the Zephyrian people had to be saved. That required a completely different approach to warfare. Dr. Marina Santos, humanity's chief xenological strategist, stepped forward to address the assembly. She had spent the past year working with former Zephyrian civilians, helping them understand how their society had become so focused on destruction that they had forgotten their own capacity for creation. The most important discovery, Dr. Santos said, was that the Zephyrian military culture was actually a relatively recent development in their species' history. Archaeological evidence suggests that pre-imperial Zephyrian civilization was based on cooperative problem-solving and artistic achievement. The conquest mentality was a learned behavior, not an inherent racial characteristic. She activated a series of holographic displays showing Zephyrian art, literature, and scientific achievement from their pre-imperial period. The works were beautiful, sophisticated, and completely inconsistent with the brutal military culture that had dominated their recent history. By helping them reconnect with their cultural heritage, Dr. Santos continued, we were able to demonstrate that their capacity for destruction was matched by their capacity for creation. The same species that had terrorized the galaxy was also capable of producing some of the most beautiful art and literature in galactic history. The transformation hadn't been easy. Entire generations of Zephyrians have been raised to believe that conquest was their species' natural destiny, that showing mercy was weakness, that compromise was surrender. Overcoming such deeply ingrained cultural programming required patience, understanding, and the kind of comprehensive social reconstruction that only humanity seemed capable of implementing. What are the other species in the region? Asked Whisper of Ancient Winds, the ethereal representative. How have the former victims of Zephyrian aggression responded to this rehabilitation project? Sarah's expression grew somber. That has been perhaps the greatest challenge. Many of the species that suffered under Zephyrian rule wanted revenge, not rehabilitation. They had lost entire worlds, entire civilizations. The concept of forgiving their oppressors was understandably difficult to accept. The display showed footage from memorial services held on restored worlds, where survivors of the Zephyrian campaigns had gathered to remember the dead. But it also showed former Zephyrian soldiers working alongside their former victims, helping to rebuild what had been destroyed, to heal what had been broken. Healing requires participation from both sides, Sarah continued. The Zephyrians had to acknowledge what they had done, to take responsibility for the suffering they had caused. But The victim species had to choose whether they wanted justice or vengeance. Justice meant holding the perpetrators accountable and ensuring that such atrocities never happen again. Vengeance meant perpetuating the cycle of violence that had led to the crisis in the first place. And how did you convince them to choose justice? Asked Representative Bright Chorus of Joy from the Melodic Confederacy. By demonstrating that justice was more powerful than vengeance, Sarah replied. When we could have exterminated the Zephyrian species entirely, we chose instead to help them become something better. When we could have claimed their worlds as spoils of war, we returned them to independence. When we could have humiliated their leaders, we offered them the chance to learn and grow. The psychological impact of humanity's choices had been profound. Species throughout the galaxy had been forced to confront their own assumptions about the nature of power and the purpose of military force. For 10,000 years, galactic civilization had operated under the assumption that might makes right, that superior technology justified territorial expansion, that military victory was its own reward. Humanity had proven that assumption wrong. They had demonstrated that true power lay not in the capacity to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when destruction was necessary and when it was not. There's another matter that must be addressed, Sarah said, and her tone became more formal. Humanity's military intervention in the Zephyrian crisis has created complications for galactic civilization. We are aware that our display of technological and tactical superiority has caused concern among many member species. The understatement was diplomatic in the extreme. Intelligence reports from across the galaxy suggested that dozens of species were desperately trying to develop countermeasures for human military technology. Defense budgets had tripled as governments attempted to cope with the reality that humanity possessed overwhelming military superiority. To address these concerns, Sarah announced, humanity is making several commitments to the Galactic Council. The main display showed a formal treaty document, written in the precise legal language that governed interstellar relations. But the contents were unlike anything in the history of galactic diplomacy. First, humanity commits to sharing our defensive technologies with any council member species that requests them. We believe that true security comes from mutual defense, not from one species maintaining overwhelming superiority. The offer was staggering. Humanity was volunteering to give away the technological advantages that had made their military intervention possible. It was a gesture of trust that demonstrated their commitment to galactic stability. Second, humanity commits to reducing our military forces to pre-crisis levels within 5 years, retaining only those capabilities necessary for defensive operations and peacekeeping missions authorized by the Council. Third, and most importantly, humanity requests that the Council establish a new framework for preventing future crises like the Zephyrian expansion. We propose the creation of an early intervention system that can identify potential threats to galactic peace before they escalate to genocide. The proposal was comprehensive, involving intelligence sharing, diplomatic mediation, cultural exchange programs, and rapid response capabilities. It was designed to ensure that no species would ever again face the choice between submission and extinction. The goal, Sarah explained, is to create a galaxy where no species ever feels so threatened, so desperate, or so isolated that genocide seems like a viable option. This requires understanding the root causes of aggressive behavior and addressing them before they manifest as military action. Representative Lokhtar of the Aquatic Federation spoke up from his biosuit. Ambassador Chun, this proposal requires an unprecedented level of cooperation between species with vastly different cultures, values, and strategic interests. What makes you believe such cooperation is possible? Sarah gestured to the assembled delegates, representing 1,200 different species from across the galaxy. Because we're already doing it. This council, despite all its flaws and inefficiencies, represents the most successful cooperative venture in galactic history. We've proven that species with fundamental differences can work together when they share common goals. The Zephyrian crisis taught us that those common goals must include not just trade and diplomacy, but security and justice. We can no longer afford to ignore aggressive expansion in the hope that it will burn itself out. We can no longer accept genocide as an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of interstellar politics. The debate that followed lasted for 17 hours, as representatives from across the galaxy wrestled with the implications of humanity's proposals. Some species feared that the new framework would limit their sovereignty, that intervention protocols might be used to justify unwanted interference in their internal affairs. Others worried that humanity's voluntary technological sharing was a trap, that accepting human defensive systems would create dangerous dependencies. The most paranoid suggested that the entire crisis had been engineered by humanity to justify their emergence as a galactic superpower. But as the debate progressed, a consensus began to emerge. The cost of inaction had been 50 million innocent lives. The price of maintaining the status quo was too high to accept. When the final vote was called, the motion passed by the largest margin in Council history. The new framework would be implemented, humanity's technological sharing would be accepted, and galactic civilization would begin the long process of evolving beyond the cycle of conquest and retaliation that had defined interstellar relations for millennia. As the session ended and delegates began filing out of the chamber, Sarah remained at the central podium, looking up at the Great Seal of the Galactic Council. A year ago, she had stood in this same spot and broken a crystal seal that had represented 3 centuries of human commitment to peace. Today, she had helped create something new, not the naive pacifism that had failed to prevent genocide, but a mature understanding of when peace was possible and when justice required action. Humanity had not abandoned peace. They had evolved beyond it, becoming something more complex and more powerful than either pure pacifism or unrestricted violence. Admiral Rodriguez appeared at her side, his uniform bearing new decorations that honored the human forces who had died in the campaign to stop the Zephyrian expansion. They had been few in number. Humanity's technological advantage had minimized casualties, but each loss had been mourned, each sacrifice remembered. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question carefully. "About breaking the peace treaty? No. About the necessity that forced us to break it? Every day. And the future?" She smiled, and in that expression was the weight of hope earned through suffering, of wisdom purchased with sacrifice. "The future is what we make it, Marcus. For 3 centuries, we try to make it peaceful. Now we'll try to make it just." As they walked together from the chamber where humanity had first renounced peace, the stars outside seemed different somehow, not cold and distant, but full of possibility. The galaxy was no longer a collection of isolated civilizations competing for resources and dominance. It was becoming something new, a community of species working together to ensure that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. The sleeping dragon had awakened, looked around, and decided that the world needed a guardian, not a destroyer. And in that choice lay the true measure of humanity's strength, not in their capacity for war, but in their wisdom to know when war was necessary and when mercy was possible. The moment humanity renounced peace, the galaxy had trembled with fear. But in the end, they had not brought destruction. They had brought something far more dangerous to tyrants and oppressors everywhere. They had brought hope.